The teacher's cruel smile widened as she pointed to the dusty piano in the corner. "Play something for us, Marcus," she mocked, certain the quiet black boy would humiliate himself in front of 30 laughing classmates. But when his fingers touched those keys, her smirk vanished, because what happened next would shake that classroom to its core and expose a truth she never saw coming. This is a story about assumptions, hidden talent, and one unforgettable performance that changed everything. The classroom fell silent as Mrs. Patterson's sharp voice cut through the air like a knife. "Marcus, since you clearly can't focus on your math worksheet, perhaps you'd like to entertain us instead?" Her cold smile made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus Washington, a quiet 12-year-old with worn sneakers and a patched backpack, looked up from his desk with wide eyes. Mrs. Patterson had been teaching at Riverside Middle School for 15 years, and everyone knew she had her favorites, and Marcus definitely wasn't one of them. She'd been singling him out for weeks, criticizing his handwriting, his posture, even the way he raised his hand. Today, she decided to take it further. "Come up here," she commanded, pointing toward the old, upright piano gathering dust in the corner of the classroom. It had been there since the school's music program was cut years ago. "I want you to play something for us. Show everyone what you can do." Her tone dripped with mockery, and a few students snickered nervously. Marcus's heart pounded as he stood up. He knew exactly what this was, another attempt to embarrass him in front of his classmates. Mrs. Patterson assumed, like she had about everything else, that he couldn't possibly know how to play piano. She wanted to watch him fumble, to prove some twisted point she'd already made up in her mind. The morning had started normally enough. Marcus had arrived early, as he always did, trying to stay invisible and avoid confrontation. He'd been working quietly on his math problems when his pencil rolled off the desk. It was such a small thing, just reaching down to pick it up, but Mrs. Patterson had seized on it immediately. "Daydreaming again, Marcus?" she'd said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe if you spent less time staring into space and more time actually working, you wouldn't be struggling so much." The comment stung because it wasn't true. Marcus had actually finished half the worksheet already, but there was no point in arguing. He'd learned that lesson the hard way during his first week in her class. Speaking up only made things worse, gave her more ammunition to use against him. So he'd stayed quiet, trying to focus on the equations in front of him, trying to ignore the heat rising in his cheeks. But Mrs. Patterson hadn't been satisfied with just that one jab. Throughout the morning, she'd circled back to his desk repeatedly, peering over his shoulder with exaggerated scrutiny. "That 7 looks like a 1, Marcus. Sloppy work." Then later, "Sit up straight. This isn't your living room." Each comment was delivered with that same patronizing tone that made his stomach twist into knots. Other students had made mistakes too. Sarah had gotten an answer completely wrong, but Mrs. Patterson had simply corrected her gently and moved on. When Jake was caught actually sleeping at his desk, she just tapped his shoulder and told him to pay attention. But with Marcus, every tiny infraction became a theatrical production, a teaching moment designed to highlight his supposed inadequacies. Now, standing in front of his classmates with all eyes on him, Marcus understood this was her masterpiece of humiliation. The piano stood like a monument to his impending failure in her eyes. Its wooden surface was covered in a thin layer of chalk dust, and several of the keys had yellowed with age. Nobody had touched it in years. It was perfect for her purposes, an impossible task designed to break him down completely. Mrs. Patterson walked over to stand beside the piano, her hand resting on its top like a game show host presenting a prize. "Well, Marcus, we're all waiting to hear your concert. Surely a bright young man like yourself must have some hidden talents you've been keeping from us." The sarcasm in her voice was thick enough to choke on. A few more students laughed, louder this time, emboldened by her cruelty. Marcus's hands felt clammy as he clenched and unclenched his fists. Part of him wanted to refuse, to just walk out of the classroom and face whatever consequences came from that. But another part of him, the part that sounded like his grandmother's gentle voice, told him to keep moving forward. He thought about all the afternoons spent in her apartment, her patient hands guiding his fingers across the keys, teaching him that music wasn't about perfection, but about truth and feeling. As Marcus walked toward the piano, his legs felt like lead. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and he could feel 30 pairs of eyes burning into his back. His best friend Tommy gave him a sympathetic look from across the room, but there was nothing anyone could do. Mrs. Patterson stood with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. "We're waiting, Marcus," she said with exaggerated sweetness. "Unless, of course, you'd like to admit you can't and return to your seat." She was giving him an out, but it was poisoned with shame. Either stumble through an embarrassing attempt or admit defeat publicly. Marcus reached the piano bench and sat down slowly. His fingers trembled as he placed them on the yellowed keys. He thought about his grandmother, who'd passed away 6 months ago. She was the one who taught him piano every afternoon in her tiny apartment, where an old keyboard sat next to family photos and the smell of sweet potato pie filled the air. "Music is your voice when words fail you, baby," she used to say. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Mrs. Patterson might have intended this as humiliation, but Marcus decided in that moment to turn it into something else entirely. He would play not because she demanded it, but because his grandmother had given him a gift that no one could take away. The piano bench creaked slightly as he adjusted his position, and he could hear someone whisper something behind him, followed by muffled laughter. The keys felt cool beneath his fingertips, smoother than he'd expected despite their age. He pressed down gently on middle C, and the note rang out clear and true. The piano was surprisingly well tuned for an instrument that had been neglected for so long. Behind him, Mrs. Patterson let out an impatient sigh. "Today will be nice, Marcus. Some of us have actual lessons to teach." Her words were meant to rattle him, to make him rush and mess up, but instead they crystallized his resolve. He thought about the first time he'd sat at his grandmother's keyboard, how intimidated he'd felt by all those black and white keys stretching out before him like an impossible puzzle. "Don't you worry about getting it perfect right away," his grandmother had told him, her weathered hands warm on his shoulders. "Music ain't about perfect. It's about honest. You play what you feel, and the rest will follow." She'd been a piano player herself back in the day, performing in church and at local gatherings before arthritis had stolen her ability to play. Teaching Marcus had been her way of keeping that part of herself alive. They'd spent 3 years together at that keyboard, every Tuesday and Thursday after school. His mother would drop him off on her way to her second job, and he'd stay until evening, learning scales and chords and eventually full pieces. His grandmother had been strict about practice, but never cruel about mistakes. "Try that passage again, baby," she'd say when he stumbled. "Feel the rhythm in your bones before your fingers even touch the keys." The memory of her voice steadied him now. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at the piano before him, really looked at it. This wasn't Mrs. Patterson's weapon to wield against him. This was an instrument, a tool for expression, and he knew how to speak its language. The trembling in his hands began to subside, replaced by a familiar sense of purpose that came whenever he approached a piano. He stretched his fingers briefly, a habit his grandmother had drilled into him. Always warm up, even if it's just for a second. Show the piano respect, and it'll respect you back. The other students were getting restless now. He could hear chairs shifting and papers rustling as they prepared for the spectacle of his failure. Mrs. Patterson moved closer, positioning herself where she could see his face, probably hoping to catch the moment of panic when he realized he couldn't do what she demanded. "I'm sure we'd all love to hear what you prepared for us," she said, her voice dripping with false encouragement. "Go ahead, whenever you're ready. Or not ready, as the case may be." Marcus positioned his hands properly over the keys, left hand ready for the lower notes, right hand poised above the melody line. His grandmother had made him practice hand positioning for weeks before she'd let him play anything substantial. "Your foundation matters, Marcus. Build it strong, and you can play anything." He could almost feel her presence beside him now, guiding him like she had so many times before. The choice of what to play came to him suddenly and with absolute certainty. He would perform the piece his grandmother had been teaching him right before she passed away, the one he'd finally mastered 2 weeks after her funeral when he'd played it alone in the empty apartment one last time. It was her favorite, and it would be his tribute to her and his answer to Mrs. Patterson's cruelty all at once. Marcus's fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata filled the classroom. The change was instantaneous. The soft, haunting melody silenced every whisper, every shuffling of papers. Mrs. Patterson's smirk began to fade as Marcus's hands moved with surprising grace and confidence across the keyboard. He didn't play tentatively or make beginner mistakes. Instead, his fingers danced through the complex passages with the skill of someone who'd spent countless hours practicing. The music swelled and dipped, carrying emotion that seemed impossible from a 12-year-old boy. He poured everything into it, his grief for his grandmother, his frustration with the unfairness he faced, his determination to prove he was more than anyone's assumptions. Students sat frozen in their seats, mesmerized. Tommy's mouth hung open in shock. Even the class troublemaker, Jake, who never paid attention to anything, leaned forward with genuine interest. The dusty classroom transformed into a concert hall, and Marcus was no longer the kid being picked on. He was an artist commanding respect. The delicate triplet patterns of the first movement flowed from his fingers like water, each note perfectly placed and weighted. His grandmother had spent months helping him understand the emotional landscape of this piece. Beethoven wrote this when his heart was breaking, she'd told him. You got to find that same kind of feeling inside yourself. Not sadness exactly, but something deeper, something that makes you human. Now Marcus understood what she meant. Every note became a statement, a quiet defiance against every dismissive comment, every rolled eye, every time he'd been made to feel less than. The music wasn't loud or aggressive, but it carried a power that filled every corner of the room. His left hand maintained the steady, rolling accompaniment, while his right hand sang out the melody with a tenderness that made several students sit up straighter in their chairs. Sarah, who sat in the front row, had stopped doodling in her notebook entirely. Her pen hung suspended in midair as she watched Marcus's hands move across the keys with fluid precision. The girl next to her, Jessica, had tears forming in the corners of her eyes, though she couldn't have explained why. There was something about the way Marcus played that reached past the surface and touched something raw and real. Mrs. Patterson's expression had shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion, and now to something that looked almost like disbelief. She took a small step backward, her arms dropping slowly to her sides. The confident posture she'd maintained moments ago had crumbled. She glanced around the room, as if seeing her students' reactions for the first time, noticing how completely Marcus had captured their attention. Marcus moved into a more technically challenging section, his fingers crossing over each other with practiced ease. His grandmother had made him practice this particular passage hundreds of times. "This is where amateurs fall apart," she'd said. "But you're not going to be an amateur, are you? You're going to be someone who respects the music enough to get it right." He'd complained at the time, frustrated by the repetition, but now he was grateful for her insistence on excellence. The room had become so quiet that the sound of the old radiator clicking on seemed intrusive. Outside, a car horn honked somewhere in the distance, but inside the classroom, time seemed to have stopped. Marcus was completely absorbed in the music now, no longer thinking about Mrs. Patterson or his classmates. He was back in his grandmother's apartment, feeling her pride radiating from the chair where she'd sit and listen, occasionally nodding her approval or offering gentle corrections. Tommy found himself gripping the edge of his desk, completely transfixed. He'd known Marcus since 3rd grade, had eaten lunch with him nearly every day for years, but he'd never known about this. Marcus had never mentioned playing piano, never talked about music at all. Tommy felt a surge of pride for his friend, mixed with anger at himself for never asking Marcus more about his life outside of school. Even the students who'd laughed earlier now looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with each other. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by genuine awe. Marcus's playing had revealed not just talent but dedication, discipline, and depth that none of them had bothered to look for. He wasn't struggling through a simple tune or banging randomly on keys as they'd expected. He was performing a masterpiece with the kind of skill that usually took years to develop. Mrs. Patterson's face had gone pale, a light sheen of perspiration visible on her forehead. She glanced toward the door as if considering leaving, but her feet remained planted where they were. Her hands clasped and unclasped nervously. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that she seemed uncertain of her place in it. The teacher who'd been so eager to orchestrate a student's humiliation was now watching that same student command the room with undeniable talent and grace. Marcus transitioned into the final phrases of the first movement, each note carefully shaped and released. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. "The ending is just as important as the beginning, baby. Don't rush it. Let each note say goodbye properly." He slowed slightly, giving each chord room to breathe and resonate before moving to the next. As the final movement of the piece approached, Marcus transitioned seamlessly into an improvisation, adding his own emotional flair to the classical composition. His grandmother had taught him that the best musicians don't just play notes, they tell stories. And Marcus had a story to tell. Mrs. Patterson's face had gone pale. Her arms slowly uncrossed, and she took a small step backward. The realization of what she'd done, what she'd almost destroyed, began to dawn on her. This wasn't just a kid who could play a few chopsticks. This was genuine talent, nurtured and developed despite circumstances that probably made lessons difficult to afford. When Marcus struck the final, lingering chord and let it fade into silence, No one moved. The classroom remained suspended in that perfect moment. Then, spontaneously, Tommy started clapping. Within seconds, the entire class erupted in applause, students jumping to their feet with genuine appreciation and surprise. The sound of clapping filled the room like thunder, and Marcus lifted his hands from the keys, almost startled by the response. He turned slowly on the piano bench, his eyes adjusting to the sight of his classmates, standing and applauding. Some were whistling. Sarah was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, not bothering to hide her tears anymore. Jessica was clapping so hard her hands had turned red. "That was incredible," someone shouted from the back of the room. Marcus couldn't see who it was through the crowd of standing students. Jake, the boy who usually spent class time flicking paper footballs and making jokes, was shaking his head in amazement. "Dude, where did you learn to play like that?" he called out, genuine curiosity replacing his usual sarcastic tone. Tommy pushed his way through the desks to reach Marcus. His face split in a huge grin. "Why didn't you ever tell me you could do that?" he asked, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "That was like professional level stuff, man. I've seen concert videos on YouTube that weren't that good." Other students crowded around, all talking at once, asking questions, offering compliments that would have seemed impossible just 10 minutes earlier. Mrs. Patterson remained frozen near the blackboard, her carefully constructed authority shattered around her feet like broken glass. The colors still hadn't returned to her face, and her mouth opened and closed several times as if she were trying to form words but couldn't quite manage it. For perhaps the first time in her 15-year career, she was utterly speechless. Marcus stood up from the bench, overwhelmed by the attention, but also feeling something lift from his chest, a weight he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. Around him, his classmates continued to buzz with excitement and disbelief. A girl named Maria, who'd never spoken to him before, grabbed his arm gently. "My mom runs the community center downtown," she said breathlessly. "They have open mic nights every month. You should totally come play. People would lose their minds." "Seriously, Marcus, have you ever thought about competing?" asked David, a student who played trumpet in the school band. "There are youth competitions all the time. With skills like that, you could probably win scholarships or something." The word scholarship hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Marcus had never considered that his playing could lead to anything beyond the private joy it brought him and the connection to his grandmother. The classroom doors suddenly opened, and Mr. Chun, the math teacher from next door, poked his head in. "Is everything all right? I heard music, and then all this noise." He stopped mid-sentence, taking in the scene. Students clustered around Marcus, the piano with its lid still open, Mrs. Patterson standing pale and silent by the wall. "What's going on here?" Marcus just played the most amazing piano piece, Tommy announced proudly, still standing protectively near his friend. "You should have heard it, Mr. Chun. It was unbelievable." Several other students chimed in with agreement, their voices overlapping in enthusiasm. Mr. Chin's eyebrows rose in surprise. He looked at Marcus with new interest, then at the piano, then at Mrs. Patterson's stricken expression. Something in her face seemed to communicate the full story, and his features softened with understanding. "Well," he said carefully, "that sounds like quite a performance. I'm sorry I missed it." He gave Marcus an encouraging nod before quietly closing the door and returning to his own classroom. The applause had finally died down, but the energy in the room remained electric. Students returned to their seats reluctantly, still buzzing with conversation. Marcus stood near the piano, unsure of what to do next. His heart was still racing, but it was no longer from fear. It was from the rush of having shared something deeply personal and having it received not with mockery, but with genuine appreciation. Mrs. Patterson finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than usual, stripped of its earlier sharpness. That was, "You may return to your seat, Marcus." The words were nearly identical to what she might have said in triumph if he'd failed, but now they carried an entirely different weight. There was no satisfaction in them, no smugness, just a hollow recognition that something had fundamentally changed in her classroom. Marcus walked back to his desk, but the journey felt completely different from his walk to the piano. Students reached out to touch his arm as he passed, offering quiet words of praise. When he sat down, Tommy leaned over from the next desk. "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen," he whispered. "She tried to embarrass you, and you just completely turned it around. Your grandma would be so proud, man." The mention of his grandmother made Marcus's throat tighten with emotion. Tommy was right. She would have been proud, not just of his playing, but of his courage to transform a moment of intended humiliation into something beautiful. Marcus stood up from the piano bench, his face flushed but his eyes bright. For the first time in months, he stood tall in that classroom. Mrs. Patterson seemed to struggle for words, her carefully constructed authority crumbling around her. "That was, you may return to your seat," she managed weakly. As Marcus walked back to his desk, his classmates patted his shoulders and whispered congratulations. The energy in the room had shifted permanently. Several students who'd never spoken to him before asked where he'd learned to play, and Tommy declared loudly that Marcus should definitely try out for the school's talent show. Mrs. Patterson returned to the lesson, but her voice had lost its sharp edge. That single performance had revealed more than musical talent. It had exposed the danger of assumptions and the power of giving people a chance to show who they really are. Marcus had walked up to that piano expecting humiliation, but left it having reclaimed his dignity through the very tool meant to strip it away. The old piano in the corner would never gather dust quite the same way again. The rest of the class period passed in a strange, subdued atmosphere. Mrs. Patterson attempted to continue with the math lesson, writing equations on the board with trembling hands, but her usual commanding presence had evaporated. She stumbled over explanations she'd given hundreds of times before, losing her train of thought mid-sentence. When she called on students to answer questions, her voice lacked its typical edge of judgment. She didn't criticize anyone's handwriting or posture. She didn't single anyone out for correction. Marcus noticed that she avoided looking in his direction entirely, her eyes skipping over his desk as if it were invisible. When she did accidentally make eye contact with him, she quickly looked away, a flush of shame creeping up her neck. It was clear that something fundamental had broken inside her carefully maintained facade, and she didn't know how to repair it. The students noticed too. They exchanged glances with each other, unspoken questions passing between them about what they'd witnessed. How many other times had Mrs. Patterson made assumptions about students? How many other talents or struggles or stories had she dismissed without bothering to look deeper? The classroom felt different now, as if a veil had been lifted and everyone was seeing each other, and their teacher, with clearer eyes. When the bell finally rang for lunch, students gathered their books slowly, many of them still lingering near Marcus's desk. A quiet girl named Keisha, who usually sat in the back corner, approached him hesitantly. My little brother takes piano lessons, she said softly. But he gets frustrated and wants to quit. Would you maybe talk to him sometime? I think hearing from someone his own age who plays so beautifully might help. Before Marcus could respond, another student chimed in. Hey, my church is looking for someone to play for the youth service next month. Do you think you'd be interested? The offers and questions kept coming, each one building on the last, each one treating Marcus as someone valuable, someone with gifts worth sharing. Tommy stayed close to Marcus's side, beaming with pride like he'd discovered a celebrity. As they headed toward the cafeteria together, Tommy couldn't stop talking. I still can't believe you never told me about the piano thing. How long have you been playing? Do you know any other pieces? Can you play modern songs too? Or just classical stuff? Marcus answered his friend's rapid-fire questions as best he could, feeling lighter than he had in months. They found their usual table in the cafeteria, but today it wasn't just the two of them. Several other students asked if they could join, and soon the table was full of animated conversation about music, talent shows, and the incredible scene from Mrs. Patterson's class that was already spreading through the school like wildfire. By the time afternoon classes began, everyone seemed to know about Marcus and the piano. Students he'd never met stopped him in the hallways to ask if the story was true. A teacher he didn't recognize gave him an approving nod. Even Principal Morrison caught up with him between periods. I heard about what happened in Mrs. Patterson's class, he said, his expression unreadable. I'd like to talk with you about it tomorrow during lunch, if that's all right. And Marcus? He paused, his stern features softening slightly. I'm glad you played. When Marcus returned to Mrs. Patterson's classroom for the final period of the day, he noticed something different. Someone had wiped the dust off the piano. The lid was still open, and there was a small note propped against the music stand written in unfamiliar handwriting. It simply said, "Please play again sometime." Marcus never found out who left it, but he saw several students glancing at the piano with hopeful expressions throughout the class. Mrs. Patterson's behavior remained subdued. She taught the lesson mechanically, without her usual barbs or criticisms. When class ended and students filed out, she called out quietly, "Marcus, could you stay for a moment, please?" Her voice held none of its former sharpness, just a tired uncertainty that made her sound older and smaller than before. Marcus exchanged a quick look with Tommy, who hesitated by the door. "It's okay," Marcus told his friend. "I'll catch up with you." Tommy nodded reluctantly and left, casting one last protective glance back at Marcus. The classroom felt enormous with just the two of them in it. Mrs. Patterson stood by her desk, her hands gripping its edge as if she needed its support. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and Marcus wondered if she was going to say anything at all. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked at him directly for the first time since the performance. "I owe you an apology," she said, the words coming out stiff and uncomfortable, as if she wasn't used to saying them. "What I did today was wrong. I made assumptions about you that were unfair and unkind. Your talent is remarkable, Marcus, but more than that, I should never have tried to humiliate you regardless of whether you could play or not." She paused, her eyes glistening slightly. "I'm sorry." Marcus walked out of the classroom that day with his head held high, knowing that his grandmother's lessons had carried him through the darkest moment and transformed it into his brightest triumph. The experience taught everyone who witnessed it a powerful truth. We should never judge someone's worth based on assumptions or appearances, because every person carries hidden depths, untold stories, and remarkable gifts that deserve to be seen and celebrated. Sometimes the very situations meant to diminish us become the stages where we shine brightest. And true strength isn't found in tearing others down, but in rising above cruelty with grace and letting our authentic talents speak louder than any words ever could. Marcus had proven that dignity cannot be taken away. It can only be given away. And he had chosen to hold on to his, turning a moment of intended shame into a lesson in humanity that no one in that classroom would ever forget. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful video. Thanks for watching.